Okay, this is video 2 for APUSH for April 1st, right in the middle of Jacksonian democracy and the spoils system. Jackson's popularity ushered in the age of Jacksonian democracy, which replaced Jeffersonian republicanism. Jefferson had conceived of a nation governed by middle and upper class educated property holders, in which the government would be only as large as necessary to provide an acceptable level of services. Jefferson also envisioned a nation of yeoman farmers, farmers who owned their land, whose liberty would be protected by limiting the power of the central government. Jacksonian democracy, on the other hand, benefited from universal white male suffrage, meaning the extension of voting rights to all white males, even those who didn't own property. That's a big theme of Jacksonian democracy, the common man, universal male suffrage. A strong presidency also characterized Jacksonian democracy. Jackson parlayed his wide popularity into a mandate to challenge both Congress and the Supreme Court in a way that none of his predecessors had. You should note that, unlike Jeffersonian republicanism, Jacksonian democracy is not a coherent vision of how government should function. Jacksonian Democrats saw themselves as champions of liberty, but they did not always act as such. Jackson was not as great a thinker as Jefferson, the Enlightenment scholar. No policy of Jackson's has received more criticism by modern scholars than Jackson's treatment of Cherokees with the Indian Removal Act, passed by Congress in 1830. This in some ways represented a natural continuation of policy toward American Indians. Originally, it had been the British who established the concept that Native Americans were foreign nations, and as such, the government could go to war and make treaties with them. Often, these treaties established what the British termed Indian Territory, as was the case for the Proclamation of 1763, issued at the close of the French and Indian War. When the Americans gained their independence, the U.S. government continued to the treatment of Native Americans that had been established by the British. Some Americans, however, among them Thomas Jefferson, suggested assimilation into American culture as a solution to the Indian problem. Jefferson and others believed that if Native Americans gave up their hunting and gathering lifestyle and adopted American farming techniques and culture, in essence, learned to live on less land, then the Americans and Native Americans might coexist more peacefully. There's a little sidebar here about the West, when the West wasn't the West. In colonial times, any settlement that wasn't located around the Atlantic Ocean was said to be located on the West. But the early 19th century, definitions had changed, but not to their modern meanings. The Northwest consisted of northern states west of the Appalachians, such as Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, which are now considered the Midwest. This is why Northwestern University is located not in, say, Seattle, but in Chicago. The Southwest consisted of southern states west of the Appalachians, such as Alabama and Mississippi, which are now considered to be the Deep South. Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson were considered the foremost Westerners of the period, and were respectively from Kentucky and Tennessee. Okay. By the time of Jackson's presidency, there were 5 civilized tribes living in the South in the area east of the Mississippi, among those the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokees had developed a written language, converted to Christianity, and embraced agriculture as a way of life. Some Cherokees even owned slaves. The Cherokees had developed their own government and deemed themselves to be an independent republic within the state of Georgia. The problem arose when gold was discovered on Cherokee land, and the citizens of Georgia demanded that the Cherokee comply with provisions of the Indian Removal Act, a policy suggested by Monroe, but enacted during Jackson's tenure in office. The act demanded that the Native Americans resettle in Oklahoma, which had been deemed Indian Territory. Jackson, for his part, argued that moving away from white society was the best way to protect themselves from white encroachment and maintain their traditional customs. The Cherokees refused and brought their case to the Supreme Court. Although John Marshall, Chief Justice at the time, sided with the Cherokees in 2 cases, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia, Andrew Jackson refused to comply with court's decision and reputed to have sneered, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Between 1835 and 1838, thousands of Cherokees walked to Oklahoma under the supervision of the U.S. Army in what has become known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died of sickness and starvation on the way. It's like 15,000 moved, 4,000 died along the way to get there. Okay. One of the major issues of Jackson's presidency focused on nullification. The doctrine of nullification, first expressed by Jefferson and Madison in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, holds that the individual states have the right to disobey federal laws if they find them unconstitutional. John Marshall had established that only the Supreme Court had the power of judicial review in the landmark decision of Marbury v. Madison. The Tariff of 1828, also known as the Tariff of Abominations, was passed during the Adams administration, but it almost turned into a national crisis during the Jackson administration. In 1828, John C. Calhoun, a South Carolinian who was Jackson's vice president, anonymously published a South Carolina exposition and protest, arguing that states who felt the 50 percent tariff was unfairly high, could nullify the law. By 1830, southern states were openly discussing nullification. As such, protectionist tariffs cut into trade with Britain on which the South relied to sell its cotton and buy British wools and certain other raw materials in return. Jackson, though a strong supporter of states' rights and thought nullification endangered the Union and was thus too extreme, after the tariff of 1832 failed to lower rates to an acceptable level, South Carolina nullified the tariff. Jackson had Congress authorize a force bill threatening to call in troops to enforce the tariff, but Calhoun and Henry Clay brokered a behind-the-scenes compromise, lowering the tariff and diffusing tensions. Although the crisis subsided and South Carolina accepted the compromise tariff, no resolution was reached on the legality of the nullification, and would continue to be an issue until the Civil War. Jackson's economic policies demonstrated his distrust of both big government and northeastern power brokers. He spent much of his 2 terms downsizing the federal government and strengthening the office of presidency, though his extensive use of presidential veto. He fought against the reform movements of his time that called for increased government activism against social and economic problems. He saw to it the Second Bank of the United States fail by vetoing Congress's attempt to recharge the bank and by withdrawing federal funds and depositing them in state pet banks, what Henry Clay pushed to do to hopefully beat Jackson in the 1932 election. He felt that the Bank of the United States protected northeastern interests at the expense of the West. Jackson argued the bank was an unconstitutional monopoly, but the Supreme Court had ruled against him using a loose interpretation of the Commerce Clause in McCulloch versus Maryland. He was also suspicious of paper money, preferring hard currency such as gold or silver. His specie circular, which had ended the policy of selling government land on credit, buyers now had to pay hard cash, caused a money shortage and sharp decrease in the Treasury, and helped trigger the Panic of 1837. Congress overturned the circular in the final days of Jackson's final term. There's a little sidebar about the Bank of the United States. In the 19th century, paper money was issued not by the government, but by private banks. If you went to a bank for a $100 loan, the bank would print up some money for you. It didn't necessarily you'd have to have $100 worth of gold in its vaults to do this. If it had $10,000 worth of gold in its vaults, a bank might issue $100,000 in paper money, and as long as no more than 10% of the money was cash at the same time, the bank would be fine. What kept such a bank from printing up millions of dollars or a trillion? The main answer was that people could pay their taxes with paper money, and that paper collected at the Bank of the United States. Fear that the bank would attempt to cash in a huge amount of paper at once kept smaller banks from overusing the printing presses. Once Andrew Jackson killed the Bank of the United States, however, wildcat banks did indeed spring up and issue paper money with abandon. Add the fact that the government stopped accepting paper money in the payment for land, and people realized that all their paper money was now nearly worthless, a recipe for major depression. With only gold and silver now considered to have value, the stage was set for the late 19th century, when arguments over these metals would dominate the debate over economic policy. Okay. Slavery grew to be an ever more controversial issue during the time of Jacksonian democracy. As the Northern abolition movement grew stronger, the South experienced several slave revolts, which resulted in the use of more brutal disciplinary measures by slaveholders. The most famous of the insurrections was Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. Turner was a well-read preacher who had a vision, and he took this vision as a sign from God that a black liberation movement would succeed. As a result, he rallied a gang that proceeded to kill and then mutilate the corpses of 60 whites. In retaliation, 200 slaves were executed, with some with no connection at all to rebellion. Fearful that other slaves would hear of and emulate Turner's exploits, Southern states passed a series of restrictive laws called black codes, prohibiting blacks from congregating and learning to read. Other state laws even prevented whites from questioning the legitimacy of slavery. After Turner's Rebellion, Virginia's House of Burgesses debated ending bondage, but it did not pass a law. Okay, so let's go to the key concepts. I didn't go over the key concepts for Unit 4 yesterday, but we're going to start in the APUSH Unit 4 of the course guidebook, The Rise of Political Parties in the Era of Jefferson. In the early 1800s, national political parties continued to debate issues such as tariff powers of the federal government and relations with European powers. Supreme Court decisions and established the primacy of the judiciary in determining the meaning of the Constitution and asserted that federal laws took precedence over state laws. Following the Louisiana Purchase, the U.S. government sought influence and control over North America through a variety of means, including exploration and diplomatic efforts. Politics and regional interests. Regional interests often trumped national concerns on the basis for many political leaders in positions on slavery and economic policy. Plans to further unify the U.S. economy, such as the American system, generated debates over whether such policies would benefit agriculture or industry, potentially favoring different sections of the country. Congressional attempts at political compromise, such as the Missouri Compromise, only temporarily stemmed growing tensions between opponents in defending slavery. America on the world stage. Struggling to create an independent global presence, the United States sought to claim territory throughout North America continent and promote foreign trade. The U.S. government sought influence and control over the Western Hemisphere through a variety of means, including military action, American Indian Removal Act, and diplomatic efforts such as Monroe Doctrine. Market revolution, industrialization, we're not there yet. Market society, not there yet. Expanding democracy. The nation's transition to a more participatory democracy was achieved by expanding suffrage from a system based on property ownership to one based on voting by all adult white men, and it was accompanied by a growth of political parties. Jackson and federal power. By the 1820s and 30s, new political parties arose, the Democrats led by Andrew Jackson, the Whigs led by Henry Clay, disagreed about the role and powers of the federal government and issues such as national bank tariffs and federally funded internal improvements. Frontier settlers tended to champion expansion efforts, while American Indian resistance led to a sequence of wars and federal efforts to control and relocate American Indian populations. I think that's probably it for today. Everything else is like reform and culture stuff. All right, we'll cover the rest later on.